Marcus Webb thought the gunshot that shattered his truck's rearview mirror was just another nightmare bleeding into daylight. But his dog, Duke, knew better. The Belgian Malinois went rigid, ears pinned back, staring not at the road ahead but at something glinting in the ditch beside them. What Marcus found there wasn't a spent shell casing. It was a child's silver bracelet, half buried in fresh mud. He froze, his pulse hammering in his ears as a terrible understanding crystallized. The inheritance his late uncle had left him wasn't just a derelict watchtower in the Montana wilderness. It was a front-row seat to something unspeakable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Greyhound bus expelled Marcus Webb onto the cracked asphalt of Timber Falls with a hydraulic sigh that sounded almost apologetic. He stood there for a moment, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, squinting against the late afternoon sun that turned the surrounding pine forests into walls of shadow and gold. The bus pulled away in a cloud of diesel exhaust, leaving him alone on what passed for Main Street in this forgotten corner of Montana. The town looked like it had been assembled from spare parts of other, more successful places. A hardware store with a sun-bleached sign. A diner with foggy windows and a flickering neon promise of coffee. A gas station that seemed to sell more lottery tickets than fuel. Everything had the worn, tired look of a place that had stopped trying decades ago. Marcus was 36 years old, though the lines etched around his eyes and the premature silver threading through his dark hair suggested a man who had lived considerably longer. He was lean, with the wiry strength of someone who had learned to carry weight that wasn't visible. His face was angular, handsome in a weathered way, with a strong jaw that he kept clean-shaven and brown eyes that carried a guardedness most people mistook for unfriendliness. He wore simple clothes, faded jeans, a gray Henley shirt, and a canvas jacket that had seen better days. Everything about him suggested a man who had learned to travel light, to leave nothing behind that mattered, because losing things hurt too much. A sharp bark cut through his thoughts. Duke, his 4-year-old Belgian Malinois, sat obediently at his feet, but the dog's amber eyes were fixed on Marcus with an intensity that bordered on concern. Duke was a striking animal, his coat a rich fawn color with a black mask that gave him a perpetually serious expression. His ears stood at attention, swiveling like radar dishes, constantly processing the world around them. The dog was compact but powerfully built, every muscle visible beneath his short fur. He had been with Marcus for 2 years, a rehabilitation companion assigned through a veterans program, but their bond had transcended therapy. Duke was not just a service animal. He was Marcus's anchor to the present, his early warning system against the past. Marcus reached down and ran his hand over Duke's head, feeling the dog relax slightly under his touch. The simple gesture was grounding. It reminded him where he was and, more importantly, when he was. Not in the suffocating heat of Kandahar province. Not in the choking dust of a convoy ambush. Not in the field hospital where he had woken up to learn that 3 of his unit hadn't woken up at all. He was here, in Timber Falls, Montana, in the present, alive and mostly intact. The lawyer's letter was folded in his jacket pocket, worn soft from repeated handling over the past 3 weeks. His uncle, Leonard Webb, had died at the age of 73, alone in the watchtower he had operated for the National Forest Service for over 40 years. Marcus had only met the man twice, both times when he was a child. He remembered a tall, silent figure who smelled of pipe tobacco and pine sap, a man who seemed more comfortable with trees than people. They had exchanged perhaps a dozen words total. Yet Leonard had left Marcus everything he owned, which consisted almost entirely of the decommissioned fire watchtower and the 5 acres of land surrounding it, located deep in the Bitterroot National Forest. The inheritance made no sense. Marcus had other relatives, cousins who had actually known Leonard, who had visited him over the years. But the will had been explicit and legally airtight. Everything went to Marcus Theodore Webb, formerly Sergeant Webb of the United States Army Rangers. The lawyer had been apologetic when he explained that there was no money, no hidden fortune. Just the tower and the land, which was technically federal property under a grandfathered life estate agreement that would transfer to Marcus for the remainder of his natural life, after which it would revert to the Forest Service. Marcus had almost declined it. What did he need with a tower in the middle of nowhere? But then he had looked around his efficiency apartment in Seattle, at the walls that seemed to press in a little more each day, at the window that overlooked a parking lot, at the life he had built that felt less like living and more like waiting. And he had thought, maybe nowhere was exactly where he needed to be. He walked into the hardware store, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jangle that seemed wildly optimistic given the dim interior. The place smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and something vaguely chemical. Shelves packed with tools, rope, cans of paint, and the accumulated detritus of rural self-sufficiency stretched toward a pressed tin ceiling yellowed with age. An older man emerged from behind a counter stacked with seed catalogs. He was in his 60s, heavy-set, with an impressive beard that was more gray than brown and suspenders holding up work pants that had seen better decades. "Can I help you find something?" the man asked. His voice was friendly enough, but his eyes were doing an assessment, the kind of quick up and down that people in small towns gave to strangers. "Marcus Webb," he said, extending his hand. "I just got into town. I inherited the old Webb Watchtower up near Sawtooth Ridge. I need some supplies to make it habitable." The man's expression shifted, something flickering across his face too quickly for Marcus to read. Surprise, maybe, or concern. He shook Marcus's hand with a grip that was firm but brief. "Dale Pritchard. I run this place." He paused, scratching at his beard. "Leonard's place, huh? That's a hell of an inheritance. Tower's been sitting empty for near about 6 months now. Rough country up there." "I'm used to rough," Marcus said simply. Dale nodded slowly, his eyes flicking down to Duke, who sat perfectly still at Marcus's side. "That your dog?" "He is. Good to have a dog up there. Gets lonely." Dale moved behind the counter and pulled out a pad of paper. "What do you need?" They spent the next 20 minutes assembling a list. Propane for the old stove. Lamp oil. Basic food supplies. Firewood, though Dale mentioned there was probably a cord or two already stacked at the tower. Tools for basic repairs. A new padlock, since the old one had been cut off by the sheriff's deputy who had found Leonard's body. Water purification tablets, since the tower's well was suspect. As the list grew, so did the silence between the items, a silence that felt weighted with things Dale wanted to say but didn't. Finally, as Marcus was loading supplies into a backpack Dale had thrown in at cost, the older man spoke. "Your uncle was a good man. Kept to himself mostly, but good. Did his job well for a lot of years." "Thank you," Marcus said, though he didn't really know what he was thanking him for. Dale hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice even though they were alone in the store. "Look, I don't know what you're planning to do up there, but a word of advice. Keep your head down. Don't go wandering off the main trails, especially north toward the ridge line. That's not friendly territory, if you catch my meaning." Marcus caught his meaning, but he didn't understand it. "Why not?" Dale straightened up, his expression closing off. "Just good advice for anyone new to the area. Wildlife can be unpredictable. Easy to get turned around in those woods." He rang up the supplies with a finality that made it clear the conversation was over. Marcus paid in cash, shouldered the heavy pack, and left the store with more questions than he had arrived with. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rust. He needed to get moving. According to the map the lawyer had provided, the tower was a good 8-mile hike from where the nearest logging road became impassable to vehicles. He was adjusting the straps on his pack when a voice called out. "You're the nephew." Marcus turned. A woman was walking toward him from across the street, her stride purposeful. She was probably in her early 40s, with shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp green eyes that studied him with an intensity that was almost clinical. She wore cargo pants, hiking boots, and a fitted fleece jacket. There was a professional competence about her, the look of someone who spent more time outdoors than in. "I am," Marcus confirmed, his tone neutral. "Saracen," she said, extending her hand. "I'm a wildlife biologist with the Forest Service." I work this district. I knew your uncle. Marcus shook her hand, noting the calluses and the firm grip. Small world. Not really, she said with a slight smile. Not many people in this line of work, especially not out here. Your uncle and I crossed paths fairly regularly. I'd check in with him when I was doing surveys in his area. She paused, her expression softening slightly. I was sorry to hear about his passing. He was found by one of my colleagues during a routine check. Heart attack, they said. Quick. That's what the lawyer told me, Marcus said. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He tried to summon some feeling about it, some sadness for a man he barely knew, but it wouldn't come. Death had become too familiar to him. It had lost its ability to shock. Sarah seemed to sense his detachment, but she didn't comment on it. You planning to stay up there? For a while. Need some quiet. She nodded, as if this made perfect sense. It's quiet, all right. Tower's solid. Your uncle maintained it well. But you should know, the area's been having some issues lately. What kind of issues? She glanced around, as if checking who might be listening, though the street was empty except for a rusted pickup truck parked outside the diner. Poaching, mostly. We've had several incidents over the past year. Deer, elk, even a black bear. Someone's running a pretty sophisticated operation, but we haven't been able to nail down who or where. The local sheriff's department has been less than helpful, if I'm being honest. Marcus felt a small flicker of interest, the first he'd felt in months. Why would they be unhelpful? Sarah's jaw tightened. Small-town politics. Timber Falls survives on logging, hunting tourism, and not much else. Nobody wants to bite the hand that feeds, even if that hand is breaking federal wildlife laws. She met his eyes directly. I'm telling you this because your uncle was helping me. Unofficially. He had eyes on a lot of territory from that tower. He was keeping notes, reporting unusual activity. I think he was close to figuring out who was behind it. Was he? Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral. Maybe. He called me 2 days before he died. Said he needed to show me something, that he'd found something important. I was supposed to meet him that weekend. She let the implication hang in the air. You think his death wasn't natural, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Sarah took a breath, then shook her head. I think a 73-year-old man with a history of heart problems died of a heart attack. That's what the medical examiner ruled, and I have no evidence to suggest otherwise. But the timing bothered me. Still bothers me. She pulled a business card from her pocket and handed it to him. If you see anything unusual up there, anything at all, call me. Cell service is spotty, but there's a radio in the tower. You know how to use one? I do. Good. Channel 7 for emergencies. I monitor it when I'm in the field. She studied him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable. Welcome to Timber Falls, Marcus. I hope you find the quiet you're looking for. She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing on the empty street with a pack full of supplies, a cryptic warning from a hardware store owner, and the suggestion that his uncle's death might not have been as straightforward as everyone claimed. Duke whined softly, pressing against his leg. Marcus looked down at the dog, who was staring up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and he felt the familiar weight of decision pressing down on him. He could turn around. Get back on a bus. Return to Seattle in the small, suffocating safety of his apartment. Or he could walk into those mountains and see what his uncle had left him, what his uncle might have died knowing. It wasn't really a choice. Marcus had never been good at walking away. The hike to the tower took longer than the map suggested it would, but Marcus had expected that. Maps never accounted for reality, for overgrown trails and fallen trees and the simple exhausting fact of putting one foot in front of the other while carrying 60 pounds of supplies. Duke ranged ahead, his training evident in the way he moved, checking back every few minutes to make sure Marcus was following, his nose constantly working to process the thousand scents of the forest. The trail climbed steadily, winding through stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, the air growing cooler and thinner as they gained elevation. Marcus fell into the rhythm of the march, his body remembering what his mind sometimes wanted to forget, that he was good at this. He was good at moving through hostile terrain with purpose. The forest was not hostile, not really, but his mind didn't always make that distinction. Every snapping branch was a potential threat. Every shadow deep enough to hide something made his pulse quicken. Duke sensed it, the way the dog always sensed it, and stayed closer, his presence a reminder to breathe, to stay present, to not slip back into the war that lived just behind his eyes. The sun was beginning to set when they finally emerged into a small clearing, and Marcus got his first real look at his inheritance. The Watchtower stood like a sentinel at the edge of a rocky promontory, a tall wooden structure that rose 50 feet into the air, its four-legged base anchored to the stone with massive bolts. The cab at the top was a small glass-enclosed room, maybe 12 feet square, designed to give a 360-degree view of the surrounding forest. It looked weathered but solid, the wood silvered by decades of sun and storm. A narrow metal staircase wrapped around the exterior, leading up to the cab in a dizzying spiral. Near the base of the tower was a small cabin, little more than a shack really, with a tin roof and a stone chimney. This would have been Leonard's living quarters. Marcus could see a woodshed behind it, still stacked with split logs, and the dark mouth of what was probably a root cellar. A rough dirt track led away from the clearing, the remnants of an old Forest Service road that was now barely more than a hiking trail. The isolation was absolute. From where Marcus stood, he could see nothing but trees and mountains rolling away in every direction, an ocean of green and gray under a sky that was deepening toward purple. There were no other structures visible, no power lines, no signs of human presence except for the tower itself. The only sounds were the wind moving through the pines and the distant call of a raven. It was perfect. Marcus approached the cabin first, noting that the door had been secured with a new padlock, presumably by the authorities after Leonard's death. He used the key the lawyer had provided and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the fading daylight filtering through a single small window. It smelled of dust and disuse, but underneath that was the ghost of wood smoke and coffee, the remnants of his uncle's life. The space was Spartan. A narrow bed with a thin mattress. A small table with 2 chairs. A cast-iron stove for heat and cooking. Shelves lined with books, most of them field guides to plants and animals, a few worn paperback westerns. A counter with a basin for washing, fed by a hand pump that presumably drew from the well Sarah had mentioned. Everything was neat, orderly, maintained with a military precision that Marcus recognized and respected. He set his pack down and began the process of making the space livable. He got the stove going with kindling from the woodshed and one of the fat wood starters Dale had sold him. He primed the hand pump, working the handle until water, rust-colored at first but then running clear, gushed into the basin. He lit the kerosene lamps, their soft glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. He opened a can of stew and set it on the stove to heat, the smell of it mixing with the wood smoke in a way that was almost comforting. Duke had been exploring, his nose investigating every corner of the small cabin, but now he returned to Marcus's side, sitting expectantly. Marcus poured food into a collapsible bowl and set it down, watching as the dog ate with the focused intensity he brought to everything. When Duke finished, he lapped water from a second bowl, then stretched out on the floor near the stove, his eyes closing almost immediately. The hike had been long for both of them. Marcus ate his own meal standing up, looking out the window at the tower silhouetted against the darkening sky. He thought about Sarah's words, about his uncle calling her, about something important Leonard had found. He thought about Dale's warning not to wander north. He thought about the way people in this town seemed to be speaking in half-truths, offering information while withholding meaning. But mostly, he thought about how quiet it was. How utterly, completely quiet. And how much that quiet terrified him, because silence was where the memories lived, where the faces of dead friends waited to remind him of every mistake, every failure, every moment when he had survived and they hadn't. Duke's soft snoring pulled him back. The dog was already asleep, trusting Marcus to keep watch. That trust, unearned and absolute, was sometimes the only thing that kept Marcus tethered to the world. He finished his meal, cleaned the pot and bowl, and sat down at the small table with one of his uncle's notebooks. It was a journal, the pages filled with Leonard's neat, compact handwriting. Marcus flipped through it, seeing entries that went back years. Weather observations. Wildlife sightings. Notes about forest conditions, fire danger ratings, the health of various stands of timber. It was exactly what you would expect from a fire watcher, a meticulous record of the natural world. But then Marcus noticed something. In the margins of some pages, there were numbers. Grid coordinates, maybe, or map references. And there were dates circled, with small notations beside them. 2 vehicles north ridge. Shots heard past midnight. Lights where no lights should be. The entries were scattered, months apart at first, but then becoming more frequent in the last year of Leonard's life. And the final entry, dated just 3 days before his death, consisted of only 3 words. Their moving product. Marcus closed the notebook slowly. Product. That was a word that carried weight. It suggested not random poaching, not a few locals taking deer out of season. It suggested organization, scale, profit. It suggested something worth protecting with violence. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the tower. His uncle had been watching from up there, had seen something, had documented it. And then his uncle had died. Maybe it was a heart attack. Maybe it was just the brutal arithmetic of age catching up to a man who lived alone in the wilderness. Or maybe it was something else. Marcus had come here for quiet, for isolation, for a place to hide from the noise in his head. But standing in his uncle's cabin, reading his uncle's final words, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt the pull of a mission, the clarity of a purpose that wasn't about his own survival but about something larger. If someone had killed his uncle, if someone was using this forest for crimes they thought they could commit with impunity, then they had made a mistake. They had brought their war to ground Marcus understood. And Marcus was very, very good at war. He slept that night on his uncle's narrow bed, Duke curled up on the floor beside him. He expected the nightmares, anticipated the familiar loop of blood and dust and the weight of failure. But instead, he dreamed of the tower, of climbing those spiral stairs, of standing in the glass room at the top and watching the forest spread out below him like a living map. In the dream, he could see everything, every movement, every shadow, every secret the wilderness tried to hide. And in the dream, his uncle was standing beside him, not speaking, just watching with patient, knowing eyes. When Marcus woke, the cabin was filled with the gray light of pre-dawn. Duke was already awake, sitting by the door with his ears pricked forward. The dog was staring at the door with an intensity that made Marcus reach instinctively for the knife he kept under his pillow. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Duke let out a low growl, a sound Marcus had learned to recognize as a warning. Someone or something was out there. Marcus moved silently to the window, staying back from the opening, using the angle to scan the clearing. At first, he saw nothing, just the familiar landscape of trees and stone and the tower rising into the pale sky. Then he saw it. Movement at the edge of the clearing, near where the old forest road disappeared into the trees. A figure, just for a second, slipping between the shadows. Then another, further back, barely visible. They were being watched. Marcus's pulse didn't spike the way it used to. Instead, his mind went cold and clear, dropping into the tactical mode that had kept him alive through 3 tours. He assessed his situation with the practiced efficiency of a soldier. He was in an isolated location with limited exits. He had a knife in his fists, but no firearm. The nearest help was 8 miles away, and he had no way to call for it. He had Duke, who was trained and loyal but was still just one dog. He also had the high ground. The tower. Marcus grabbed his jacket, clipped Duke's lead to his collar, and moved to the door. He opened it slowly, scanning the clearing again. The figures were gone, or at least they were no longer visible. But the forest had that watchful quality now, the sense of eyes in the shadows. He didn't run. Running suggested fear, and fear invited pursuit. Instead, he walked with calm purpose toward the tower, Duke at his heel, his hand resting on the dog's back both for comfort and to feel any tension in the animal's body. They reached the base of the tower and Marcus started up the spiral stairs, his boots ringing on the metal. The stairs wrapped around and around, and with each turn, Marcus felt more exposed, a target on a shooting range. But no shots came. No voices called out. There was only the wind and the creak of old metal and his own measured breathing. The door to the tower cab was locked, but Marcus had that key too. He opened it and stepped inside, Duke pressing close behind him. He closed and locked the door behind them, then finally allowed himself to look. The cab was exactly as Sarah had described it, well-maintained and functional. Windows on all four sides provided an unobstructed view in every direction. There was a small desk with a chair bolted to the floor, a set of filing cabinets, and a two-way radio mounted on one wall. Binoculars hung from a hook. A detailed topographical map of the surrounding forest was pinned to a corkboard, marked with colored pins that Marcus assumed represented fires or points of interest. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, the only indication that the space had been empty for 6 months. Marcus moved to the northern window and raised the binoculars to his eyes. He spent several minutes scanning the forest, methodically covering the terrain in overlapping sections. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just trees and more trees, the landscape rolling away toward the distant peaks of the Bitterroot Range. Then he saw movement. A flash of bright orange against the green, gone almost as soon as he spotted it. Then another, further to the east. Hunters, maybe, or hikers, though they were moving too purposefully for casual recreation. Marcus spent the next hour in the tower cab, methodically documenting everything he observed through the binoculars. He found a fresh notebook in one of the desk drawers, its pages blank and ready, as if his uncle had left it there specifically for him. He sketched rough maps, noting the locations where he had seen movement, marking the time and direction of travel. The orange flashes he had spotted were definitely people, at least 4 of them, moving in a coordinated pattern through the forest roughly 3 miles north of his position. Duke had settled near the door, his body relaxed but his ears still tracking every sound. The dog's presence was calming, a reminder that Marcus wasn't alone in this strange inheritance. He reached down absently and scratched behind Duke's ears, feeling the animal lean into his touch. The radio crackled suddenly, making both of them jump. A voice emerged from the static, rough and masculine. "Tower 7, this is base. Anyone up there?" "Over." Marcus hesitated. He wasn't officially a fire watcher. He had no authorization to be using Forest Service equipment. But something in his gut told him to answer. He picked up the handset and pressed the transmit button. "This is Tower 7. Marcus Webb speaking. I'm Leonard Webb's nephew. I inherited the tower. Over." There was a pause, long enough that Marcus thought the connection had been lost. Then the voice came back, different now, more careful. "Copy that, Tower 7. This is Ranger Station at Clearwater. We weren't informed anyone would be occupying the tower. What's your purpose there?" "Over." "Personal residence," Marcus replied. "The tower and land were left to me in my uncle's will. I have documentation if needed." "Over." Another pause. "Understood. Be advised, Tower 7 is officially decommissioned. You're not obligated to report fires or maintain watch schedules. That radio is for emergency use only. Do you copy?" "Over." "I copy," Marcus said. "Appreciate the information. Tower 7 out." He hung up the handset and sat back, thinking. The voice on the other end had been professional but wary. They hadn't expected anyone to be up here. That made sense if the tower was truly decommissioned. But something about the conversation felt off, like he was being warned away rather than welcomed. Marcus turned his attention back to the map pinned to the corkboard. His uncle had marked it extensively with different colored pins. Red pins seemed to indicate fire spotting locations. Blue pins marked water sources, streams and small lakes. Yellow pins were scattered throughout, concentrated heavily in the northern sector, the same area where Dale had warned him not to wander and where Marcus had just observed the coordinated movement of multiple people. He pulled the map down and spread it across the desk, studying it more carefully. Each yellow pin had a small notation beside it written in Leonard's precise hand. Most were dates, but some had brief descriptions. Vehicle tracks. Shell casings. Blood trail. The entries painted a picture of sustained, organized activity in an area that was supposed to be pristine wilderness. Marcus found Leonard's journal again and cross-referenced the dates. His uncle had been documenting this for almost 2 years. The early entries were cautious, almost uncertain. Possible hunters, 1 read. Maybe seasonal workers. But as time went on, the tone changed. The observations became more detailed, more concerned. Leonard had started noting patterns. Vehicles arriving on the same days each month. Activity increasing after dark. The sound of chainsaws in areas where no logging was authorized. Then, 6 months ago, the entry stopped. Leonard was dead, and whatever he had discovered had died with him. Or so someone had thought. Marcus folded the map carefully and tucked it into his jacket along with the journal. He needed to see the northern sector for himself, needed to understand what his uncle had been watching. But he also needed to be smart about it. Going in blind and alone would be suicide, especially if Dale's warning had been sincere. Whoever was operating up there had enough reach to make even the hardware store owner nervous. He spent the rest of the morning familiarizing himself with the tower and its equipment. The radio had several channels, and he tested each one, listening for traffic. Most were silent, but on channel 12 he caught fragments of conversation between what sounded like logging crews, discussing equipment and weather conditions in the clipped shorthand of people who worked together regularly. On channel 9, he heard 2 men arguing about a poker debt, their voices rough with the kind of casual profanity that suggested they weren't concerned about who might be listening. The binoculars were military grade, far better than anything a typical fire watcher would need. Marcus wondered if his uncle had purchased them himself or if they had been provided by someone else, someone like Saracen. He adjusted the focus and swept the northern sector again, this time looking for anything permanent, any structure or clearing that might explain the repeated activity Leonard had documented. It took him nearly 20 minutes, but he finally spotted it. A break in the canopy, barely visible, perhaps 4 miles distant. It wasn't natural. The edges were too straight, too deliberate. Through the powerful lenses, he could just make out what looked like the roof of a building, or possibly multiple buildings, constructed from materials that blended with the forest. Camouflaged, intentionally hidden from aerial observation. Marcus lowered the binoculars and felt the familiar cold clarity of a mission objective crystallizing in his mind. He had found the target. Now he needed intelligence. He needed to know what was there, who was running it, and what they were doing that required such elaborate concealment. He descended the tower stairs with Duke at his side, his mind already working through the logistics. He would need supplies for an extended reconnaissance mission. Better equipment than what he currently had. And he would need to move at night, using darkness as his ally the way he had been trained to do. Back in the cabin, Marcus inventoried what he had. His knife was good, a 7-inch fixed blade that could serve as both tool and weapon. He had a small LED headlamp with a red filter for night vision preservation. A compass. The topographical map. Water purification tablets. Paracord. A basic first aid kit. It was enough for a careful approach, a look and listen mission. He wasn't planning to engage, just to observe. But he was also realistic. Plans failed. Contact happened. He needed something more than a knife if things went wrong. He searched through his uncle's belongings methodically, checking drawers and cabinets, looking under the bed and in the corners of the small root cellar. He found tools, spare parts for the radio, boxes of files and paperwork. But no weapons. Then he remembered the tower. His uncle would have spent most of his time up there, not down in the cabin. If Leonard had felt the need to protect himself, that's where he would have kept anything useful. Marcus climbed back up to the tower cab, this time searching it more thoroughly. He checked the filing cabinets, finding them full of old weather reports and fire incident logs. He examined the desk, opening each drawer systematically. In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of outdated Forest Service manuals, he found a locked metal box. It took him 5 minutes with his knife to pry the lock open. Inside was exactly what he had been hoping for. A Ruger SR 1911 pistol, stainless steel, well-maintained. 2 loaded magazines. A box of .45 caliber ammunition. And a note, written in Leonard's handwriting. For emergencies only. Stay safe. Marcus checked the weapon with practiced efficiency, clearing it, inspecting the barrel in action, verifying that it was in good working order. His uncle had taken care of it. The metal was oiled, the mechanism smooth. He loaded a magazine, chambered a round, engaged the safety, and tucked the pistol into his waistband at the small of his back. The weight was familiar, comforting in a way that probably should have worried him but didn't. He was loading the spare magazine into his jacket pocket when he heard it. A vehicle engine, growing louder, approaching from the direction of the old forest road. Marcus moved quickly to the north window and raised the binoculars. A mud-splattered pickup truck was grinding its way up the deteriorated road toward the tower clearing. It was moving slowly, negotiating the ruts and obstacles, but it was definitely coming here. Marcus could see 2 people in the cab, both male, both wearing the kind of heavy work clothes common in logging country. He descended the tower stairs rapidly, Duke keeping pace. By the time the truck pulled into the clearing, Marcus was standing in front of his uncle's cabin, his posture relaxed but his right hand close to the concealed pistol. Duke sat at his side, alert but calm, his training evident in the way he waited for Marcus's command. The truck stopped about 30 feet away, engine still running. The driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He was in his 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick gray beard and eyes that were doing the same assessment Marcus had received from Dale Pritchard. He wore a faded denim jacket over a flannel shirt, work boots caked with dried mud, and a baseball cap advertising a brand of chewing tobacco. "Help you?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Was about to ask you the same thing. You're a long way from anywhere." "I live here," Marcus said simply. The passenger door opened and a second man got out. He was younger, maybe mid-30s, with a lean, wiry build and a face that looked like it had been on the losing end of too many fights. His eyes were cold, flat, the kind of eyes Marcus had learned to recognize in certain types of soldiers, the ones who enjoyed the violence a little too much. This man was dangerous in a way the older one wasn't. "Leonard's nephew," the older man said, though it wasn't a question. "Word travels fast in small places." He took a step closer, his hands visible, empty. "Name's Carl Booker. I run a timber operation about 10 miles north of here. Your uncle and I were acquainted." "That right," Marcus said. Carl nodded. "Good man, Leonard. Kept to himself, didn't cause trouble. We got along fine." He paused, his eyes flicking to the tower and back to Marcus. "Shane, what happened to him?" "Heart just gave out," they said. "Happens to the best of us eventually." "So I heard." The younger man hadn't said anything, just stood by the truck with his arms crossed, his cold eyes locked on Marcus. There was an aggression in his posture that was barely contained, like a dog straining at a leash. Carl continued, his tone conversational but with an undercurrent of something harder. "Thing is, this tower's been empty for a while now. Folks around here got used to that. Got used to the privacy, if you know what I mean." He let that sit for a moment. "Now, I'm not saying you're not welcome. It's your property, fair and square. But I wanted to come by, introduce myself, maybe give you some friendly advice." "I'm listening," Marcus said. "The woods up here can be unforgiving if you don't know them. Easy to get turned around, especially in the northern sectors. Lots of drop-offs, unstable ground. We've had loggers get hurt up there, even had one die a few years back. Fell into a ravine." Carl shook his head sadly. Point is, it's safer to stick close to the tower. No reason to go wandering, especially not at night. That's when the wildlife comes out. Cougars, black bears. They don't take kindly to people stumbling around in the dark. It was the same warning Dale had given him, but coming from Carl it felt less like advice and more like a threat. Marcus kept his expression neutral. I appreciate the concern. I'm pretty comfortable in the woods. I'm sure you are, Carl said. Military, right? Leonard mentioned you'd served. That's good. Means you understand following orders, staying in your lane. He smiled again, that same empty smile. Out here, staying in your lane keeps people safe. Keeps things running smooth. The younger man finally spoke, his voice a rough rasp. Your dog bite? Only when I tell him to, Marcus replied, his gaze shifting to meet the cold eyes. Duke sensed the tension and let out a low, almost inaudible growl. The younger man's jaw tightened. Carl raised a hand slightly, a gesture that might have been conciliatory or might have been a signal. Easy now. We're all friends here. He looked back at Marcus. Like I said, just wanted to introduce myself, make sure you're settling in okay. You need anything, any help with the tower or supplies, you let me know. We take care of our own up here. I'll keep that in mind, Marcus said. Carl nodded, then turned back to his truck. The younger man followed, but he walked backwards for several steps, his eyes never leaving Marcus, making sure the message was received. They climbed into the truck, turned it around in the clearing with more difficulty than necessary, and drove back down the road in a cloud of dust and exhaust. Marcus stood watching until the sound of the engine faded completely into the forest. Then he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Duke pressed against his leg, seeking contact, and Marcus reached down to reassure the dog. 2 visitors in one day, Marcus murmured. And both of them warning me off the same stretch of forest. He looked north, toward the hidden structures he had spotted from the tower. Whatever you were watching, Uncle Leonard, it was big enough to make people nervous. He spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing for his night reconnaissance. He packed a small tactical backpack with essentials, keeping the weight minimal for fast movement. Water, energy bars, the first aid kit, extra ammunition, the map, a small digital camera he found among his uncle's possessions. He tested his headlamp, made sure his knife was secure, checked the pistol again. Duke watched all of this with interest, his tail wagging slightly. The dog knew these preparations meant they were going somewhere, doing something, and Duke lived for purpose the same way Marcus did. As sunset approached, Marcus forced himself to eat and rest. He would need his strength. He stretched out on the narrow bed and closed his eyes, not sleeping but letting his body relax, conserving energy the way he had learned to do before every mission. Duke curled up beside the bed, his breathing deep and even. When full darkness came, Marcus rose and geared up. He pulled on dark clothing, a black fleece jacket over a gray shirt, dark cargo pants, boots that were broken in but still solid. He clipped the pistol to his belt at the small of his back where it was accessible but wouldn't snag on branches. The knife went on his left hip. The backpack settled across his shoulders, its weight familiar and comforting. He knelt down and looked Duke in the eyes. Tonight you stay here, boy. Guard the cabin. He hated leaving the dog behind, but where he was going required absolute silence, and Duke, for all his training, was still an animal. One bark at the wrong time could be fatal. Duke whined softly, clearly unhappy with this arrangement, but he sat obediently when Marcus gave the command to stay. Marcus locked the cabin door from the outside, tucking the key under a stone near the entrance where he could find it in the dark if he needed to get back quickly. Then he turned toward the north and began to walk. The forest at night was a different world. Sounds that were muted during the day became amplified. The rustle of nocturnal animals moving through the undergrowth. The call of an owl hunting somewhere in the darkness. The whisper of wind through the high branches. Marcus moved slowly, placing each foot carefully, avoiding dry branches and loose stones. He used his compass and the map to navigate, but mostly he trusted his instincts and the training that had been drilled into him through years of night operations in places far more hostile than this. He covered the first mile in 40 minutes, taking his time, stopping frequently to listen. His eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and he used the faint starlight filtering through the canopy to guide him. He didn't use his headlamp. Light could be seen from a long distance at night, and he was moving toward people who wouldn't welcome his presence. The terrain grew rougher as he moved north. The ground sloped upward, becoming rocky and broken. He had to navigate around steep ravines and dense thickets of undergrowth. Several times he heard sounds that made him freeze, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol, but each time it was only an animal, a deer bounding away or a raccoon scurrying through the leaves. After 2 hours of careful movement, he smelled it. Wood smoke, faint but unmistakable. And something else, a chemical odor he couldn't quite identify. He slowed even further, now moving at a glacial pace, testing each step before committing his weight. He came to the edge of a ridgeline and dropped to his stomach, crawling the last few yards to where he could see down into a small valley. What he saw made his breath catch. Below him, concealed by the natural terrain and the dense canopy overhead, was a compound. 3 large structures, built from rough-cut timber and corrugated metal, arranged in a rough triangle around a central clearing. Floodlights mounted on poles illuminated the area, though they were positioned to shine downward, minimizing the light visible from above. Several vehicles were parked near the largest building, including the mud-splattered pickup that had visited him earlier that day. But it wasn't the buildings or the vehicles that held Marcus's attention. It was what was happening in the clearing. A group of men, maybe a dozen, were gathered around the back of a large cargo truck. They were unloading something, working with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Marcus couldn't see clearly from this distance, but the way they moved, the way they handled the cargo with a mixture of care and urgency, suggested this wasn't timber. He pulled out the small digital camera and used its zoom function to get a better look. Through the lens, he could see details. The men were armed, several of them with rifles slung over their shoulders. The cargo they were unloading consisted of large plastic-wrapped bundles, the kind of packaging Marcus had seen in briefings about drug interdiction operations. This wasn't a poaching operation. This was a drug distribution hub, hidden deep in the national forest where it could operate with impunity. Marcus took several photographs, documenting the buildings, the vehicles, the men, the cargo. He was careful to turn off the camera's flash, relying on the ambient light from the floodlights below. He counted the men, noting their positions, their weapons, their patterns of movement. This was intelligence gathering, pure and simple, the kind of work he had done 100 times in places whose names he tried not to remember. He was about to pull back, having seen enough to confirm his suspicions, when a door to the largest building opened and someone else emerged. Even from this distance, even in the harsh artificial light, Marcus recognized him. Carl Booker, the friendly timber boss who had come to welcome him to the neighborhood. Carl walked directly to the truck and began talking to the men unloading it, gesturing, clearly in command. Marcus took more photographs. Then he carefully, silently, began to crawl backwards, putting distance between himself and the ridge before he stood up. He had what he needed. Proof that something illegal was happening here. Proof that his uncle's suspicions had been correct. And proof that the people involved were willing to visit a federal ranger's inheritor to warn him away, which meant they knew he was there and they were worried about it. He was halfway back to the tower, moving through a dense section of forest, when he heard the dogs. The sound sent ice through his veins. Not the casual barking of pets, but the focused, driven baying of tracking dogs on a scent. They were coming from the direction of the compound, and they were coming fast. Marcus broke into a run. Stealth was no longer an option. His boots pounded against the forest floor as he dodged between trees, vaulted over fallen logs, crashed through undergrowth that tore at his clothes and skin. The baying grew louder, closer. They were gaining. His mind raced through options. He couldn't outrun dogs, especially not in terrain they knew better than he did. He couldn't climb a tree fast enough. He couldn't hide his scent. Fighting was possible but suicidal. There were at least 2 dogs, probably more, and men with guns would be following them. He burst out of the tree line into a small clearing and saw the solution. A stream, not large but moving fast, the water black and cold. Water would break his scent trail, at least temporarily. Marcus didn't hesitate. He plunged into the stream, the shock of the cold water stealing his breath. The current was stronger than it looked, and the rocks beneath his feet were slick. He waded upstream, moving as quickly as he could while staying in the water, putting distance between himself and where he had entered. The baying reached the clearing behind him. He could hear men's voices now, shouting, coordinating. Lights swept through the trees, powerful flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Marcus kept moving, his legs going numb from the cold, his lungs burning from the exertion. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, he spotted an opportunity. A fallen tree stretched across the stream, its root ball forming a natural cave on the far bank. Marcus climbed out of the water on the opposite side from where he had been traveling, crawled into the space beneath the root ball, and froze. He controlled his breathing, slowing it deliberately despite his body's screaming need for oxygen. He couldn't see much from his hiding spot, just a narrow slice of the stream and the forest beyond. But he could hear everything. The dogs reached the stream and stopped, confused. They circled the bank, whining, unable to pick up the scent. The men arrived moments later. Marcus counted at least 4 distinct voices, all of them angry and frustrated. "Lost him in the water," one voice said. "Could have gone either direction." "Fan out," another voice ordered. "Check both banks." "He's on foot." "He can't have gone far." Carl's voice cut through the others, authoritative and cold. "Whoever it is saw too much. Find him." The men spread out along the stream, their lights sweeping back and forth. Marcus pressed himself deeper into the space beneath the roots, his hand on the pistol, knowing that if they found him he would have to fight, and that fighting meant dying. 1 man against 4 or more, in their territory, with dogs. The math was brutal and simple. A light swept over the fallen tree, pausing for a moment that stretched into infinity. Marcus didn't breathe. Didn't blink. Became stone. The light moved on. The search continued for another 30 minutes, the men working both sides of the stream, the dogs ranging back and forth. But the water had done its job. Marcus's scent trail was broken, and in the darkness and confusion, they couldn't track him. Eventually, reluctantly, they gave up. "We'll find him tomorrow," Carl's voice said. "In daylight, with more men. He's probably that fool nephew. Should have handled him differently." "You want me to go to the tower now?" another voice asked. "No. If he made it back there, he's dug in. We do this smart. Tomorrow, we go official. Sheriff can pay him a visit, check his credentials, make sure everything's in order. We'll see what he knows, what he's got. Then we decide." The voices faded as the men moved back toward the compound. The dogs were called off, their baying growing distant. Marcus remained in his hiding spot for another hour, making absolutely certain they were gone. His body was shaking from the cold and the adrenaline crash, but his mind was clear. They knew. They knew someone had been watching them. And they suspected it was him. By tomorrow, they would come for him, but they would come under the guise of legitimate authority. The sheriff, Carl had said. The same sheriff who was probably on their payroll. Marcus finally emerged from his hiding spot, his clothes soaked, his skin numb. He had lost his bearings in the chase and had to use his compass to reorient himself. The journey back to the tower took twice as long as the journey out. He was exhausted, cold to the bone, and his body was running on nothing but willpower. But he had the photographs. He had proof. And he had a plan forming in his mind, cold and clear as the water that had saved his life. When he finally stumbled into the clearing around the tower, dawn was just beginning to break. Duke heard him coming and began barking frantically from inside the cabin. Marcus unlocked the door and the dog burst out, circling him, whining with relief and concern. Marcus dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in Duke's fur. "I'm okay," "Boy," he whispered. "I'm okay." But they both knew that wasn't true. Marcus was trapped. He was in the middle of a national forest, surrounded by criminals who knew he was a threat, with no way to call for help that they couldn't intercept, and with official law enforcement likely compromised. The nearest person he could trust was Saracen, and she was more than a day's hike away through terrain that would now be actively hostile. He dragged himself into the cabin and stripped off his wet clothes with shaking hands. He dried off and changed into dry garments, then forced himself to eat and drink. His body needed fuel if he was going to survive what was coming. He sat at his uncle's small table and looked at the digital camera, reviewing the photographs he had taken. They were clear, damning. Buildings, vehicles, armed men, drug packages, Carl Booker's face clearly visible. It was enough to bring down the entire operation, but only if he could get the evidence to someone who would act on it. Marcus knew what his uncle had discovered. Leonard had been watching the same compound, documenting the same crimes. And Leonard had called Saracen, had told her he had something important to show her. 2 days later, Leonard was dead. Heart attack, everyone said. Natural causes. But Marcus didn't believe in coincidences, not anymore. His uncle had been murdered, quietly and cleverly, in a way that looked natural. And now Marcus was next on the list. He downloaded the photographs to his uncle's old laptop, then copied them to a thumb drive. He wrote out everything he had seen, every detail he could remember, dating and signing the document. Evidence. Testimony. The truth, documented for whoever might find it after he was gone. Because Marcus was under no illusions about his chances. He was one man, with one dog, one pistol, and one knife, facing an organized criminal operation with resources, manpower, and the protection of corrupt local law enforcement. The smart move would be to run, to abandon the tower and hike out to the east, away from Carl's territory, and not stop until he reached civilization and a phone that worked. But Marcus had spent his entire military career not taking the smart move when people needed help. And somewhere in that compound, he was certain, were victims. The drugs had to be coming from somewhere and going to somewhere, which meant there was infrastructure, distribution networks, people being poisoned and destroyed by what Carl Booker was moving through these mountains. His uncle had tried to stop it and died. Marcus could run and live, or he could stand and maybe stop it himself. It wasn't really a choice. He secured the thumb drive in a waterproof container and buried it in the floor of the root cellar, marking the location. If something happened to him, if Saracen or someone else came looking, they would find it. The truth would survive even if he didn't. Then Marcus Webb, former Army Ranger, prepared for war. The morning sun climbed slowly over the eastern ridges, painting the forest in shades of copper and gold that would have been beautiful if Marcus had the capacity to appreciate beauty. Instead, he moved through the cabin with the mechanical precision of a soldier preparing for what might be his last stand. Duke shadowed his every movement, the dog's anxiety manifesting in restless pacing and soft whines that Marcus wished he could alleviate with reassurance he didn't feel. Marcus had perhaps 6 hours before Carl's people arrived under whatever pretense they had constructed. 6 hours to fortify his position and plan for contingencies that all ended badly. The tower itself was defensible but also a trap. Once inside, there was only one way down, and anyone controlling the base of the stairs controlled his fate. The cabin offered better options for escape but was vulnerable from multiple angles and provided minimal cover against sustained fire. He chose a third option. He would turn the entire clearing into his battlefield, using the terrain and his knowledge of tactical defense to create advantages where none naturally existed. It was what he had been trained to do, what he had done in places whose names still woke him at night. The difference was that in those places, he had had a team, air support, artillery, and extraction plans. Here, he had Duke and the contents of his uncle's modest homestead. Marcus started with the approaches. There were 3 viable routes into the clearing: the old forest road from the south, a game trail from the east, and a rocky path from the west that connected to the ridge system. The northern side was protected by a steep drop-off that would require climbing gear to navigate. He focused his efforts on the 3 accessible routes. From the woodshed, he he retrieved Leonard's collection of hand tools and began constructing obstacles. He felled 2 smaller trees across the forest road using a combination of saw work and strategic wedging, creating a barrier that would force vehicles to stop well short of the clearing. He positioned the fallen trees so that anyone attempting to clear them would be exposed and visible from multiple defensive positions. Along the game trail, he strung thin wire at ankle height between trees, not enough to cause serious injury but sufficient to trip someone moving quickly and to announce their presence with the crash of their fall. The rocky western path was more challenging. He couldn't block it without giving away his preparations, so instead he prepared surprises. He loosened several large stones along the slope above the path, wedging them in place with smaller rocks that could be kicked free remotely using a length of rope. An improvised rock slide wouldn't stop a determined assault, but it would slow one and potentially injure pursuers. Throughout these preparations, Marcus maintained constant surveillance from the tower. Every 30 minutes, he would climb the spiral stairs and scan the surrounding forest with his uncle's powerful binoculars, looking for any sign of movement or early approach. So far, the forest remained quiet, but that silence felt predatory, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. By noon, the physical defenses were as complete as time allowed. Marcus turned his attention to supplies and weapons. The pistol had 2 magazines, 15 rounds total. Not nearly enough for a sustained firefight, but sufficient if he was smart and chose his shots carefully. The knife was always available, though he hoped circumstances wouldn't force him into close combat. In his experience, fights that ended in knife range meant someone had already made catastrophic mistakes. He gathered everything combustible in the cabin into a pile near the door. Kerosene from the lamps, cooking oil, the rubbing alcohol from the first aid kit, even the varnish Leonard had used to maintain the woodwork. If retreat became necessary, he could create a wall of fire between himself and pursuers. Fire was a last resort, but then again, this entire situation was a last resort. Duke's anxiety had grown throughout the morning, the dog's normally calm demeanor replaced by restless energy. Marcus took a moment to kneel beside him, looking into those intelligent amber eyes that reflected back his own tension. The dog was feeding off his stress, amplifying it in a feedback loop that helped neither of them. "Easy, boy," Marcus said quietly, running his hands through Duke's thick coat. "I need you steady today. Can you do that for me?" Duke whined but settled slightly under his touch. The dog had been through difficult situations before, had been trained to remain calm under stress, but this was different. There was no structured training exercise to fall back on, no handler giving clear commands. This was pure survival, and Duke could sense it. Marcus stood and moved to the tower one more time, needing the elevated perspective to calm his racing thoughts. From the cab, the forest stretched out in every direction, seemingly infinite, indifferent to human concerns. Somewhere out there, Carl Booker was gathering his people, deciding how to handle the problem Marcus represented. The question was whether Carl would try to maintain the veneer of legitimacy or whether he would simply send armed men to eliminate a witness. The answer came sooner than Marcus expected. He spotted the dust plume first, rising above the southern tree line where the old forest road wound through the mountains. Vehicles, multiple vehicles, moving toward the tower. Marcus trained the binoculars on the approaching convoy and counted 3 trucks, including Carl's distinctive mud-splattered pickup. As they drew closer, he could see uniformed figures in the lead vehicle. The sheriff's department, exactly as Carl had promised. They were coming official, which meant Carl was still hoping to control the situation without overt violence. That gave Marcus a sliver of hope, a narrow window where talking might accomplish what fighting could not. But it also meant he was dealing with people who had authority to arrest him, to take him somewhere isolated, to make him disappear in ways that would look completely legal. The convoy reached the fallen trees blocking the road and stopped. Doors opened and men emerged, 6 in total. 3 wore sheriff's department uniforms, including one man Marcus recognized from a photograph in Dale's hardware store as Sheriff Hammond, a heavy-set man in his early 60s with a tobacco-stained mustache. The other 3 were Carl's people, dressed in civilian clothes but moving with the coordinated awareness of men accustomed to violence. Carl himself stood near his truck, arms crossed, watching the tower. Marcus descended from the cab and positioned himself in front of the cabin with Duke at his side. He kept his hands visible, unthreatening, though the pistol was tucked at the small of his back under his jacket. He watched as the group conferred briefly, then began walking up the road toward the clearing, leaving their vehicles behind the obstruction. Sheriff Hammond led the way, his hand resting casually on his duty weapon but not drawing it. The others fanned out slightly, professional but not overtly aggressive. When they reached the edge of the clearing, about 40 feet from where Marcus stood, Hammond raised his hand in what might have been a friendly greeting or might have been a signal to his men. "Marcus Webb," Hammond called out, his voice carrying easily across the open space. "I'm Sheriff Ben Hammond. Need to have a word with you." "About what?" Marcus replied evenly. "Got a complaint filed against you. Trespassing on private property, interference with a lawful timber operation." Hammond's tone was conversational, reasonable, the voice of a man just doing his job. "Thought we'd come up here, sort things out like civilized people." "This is my property," Marcus said. "Left to me by my uncle. I have documentation." "Sure you do. All the same, need you to come down to town, answer some questions, get everything straightened out properly." Hammond took a step forward. "How about you pack a bag? We'll give you a ride down the mountain, make this easy on everyone." "I'm comfortable here," Marcus said. "You want to ask questions, you can ask them right where you stand." Hammond's friendly expression tightened slightly. "Son, I'm trying to be polite about this. But what I'm asking isn't optional. You're coming with us, one way or another. Better for everyone if you cooperate." Carl stepped forward then, moving up beside Hammond. His expression was harder than it had been during his friendly visit the day before. "Marcus, let's not make this difficult. You're new here, you don't understand how things work. Come down to town, we'll clear up the misunderstanding, maybe I'll even drop the complaint. All this can go away easy." Marcus looked past them, noting positions, angles, distances. The men were spread out enough that he couldn't cover all of them at once, but close enough together that none of them had good cover if shooting started. He calculated odds and didn't like what the math told him. 6 against 1, even with surprise on his side, even with Duke's help, was suicide. But surrender was also suicide, just slower. Once they got him away from the tower, away from any witnesses, he would disappear. They couldn't risk letting him talk about what he'd seen, what he'd photographed. The evidence buried in the root cellar would never be found. His uncle's death would remain unexplained. The compound in the northern sector would continue operating. Marcus made his decision. "I'm not going anywhere with you," he said clearly. "And you're not coming any closer to this cabin. You want to arrest me, you can try, but understand what that means." The pretense of friendliness evaporated from Hammond's face. His hand moved to his weapon, not quite drawing it but making the threat explicit. "You threatening law enforcement, Webb? Because that's a felony right there." "Not threatening anyone," Marcus said. "Declining an unlawful order. There's a difference." Carl's jaw tightened. "Do your job, Ben." Hammond's eyes narrowed. "Marcus Webb, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and threatening a peace officer. Turn around, hands behind your head, knees on the ground. Do it now." Marcus didn't move. Duke growled, a low rumbling that carried warning in every note. The standoff held for a long moment, both sides recognizing that the next move would determine whether this ended in talking or dying. Then one of Carl's men, the cold-eyed younger man from the previous day's visit, made the choice for everyone. He drew a pistol from under his jacket and fired. The shot went wide, rushing past Marcus and thunking into the cabin wall behind him. But it shattered the fragile piece like glass exploding. Marcus dropped into a crouch, drawing his own weapon in one smooth motion as Duke exploded forward with a snarling fury that was pure protective instinct. The dog hit the cold-eyed man like a missile, 80 pounds of muscle and teeth driving him backward. The man screamed as Duke's jaws clamped onto his arm, the pistol falling from nerveless fingers. The clearing erupted into chaos. Marcus fired twice, controlled shots aimed at the ground near Hammond's feet, forcing the sheriff to dive for cover. Carl's other 2 men scattered, one running for the tree line, the other trying to circle around toward the cabin. The remaining deputies were drawing their weapons, shouting contradictory orders. Marcus whistled sharply, the recall command Duke knew better than his own name. The dog released the screaming man and sprinted back toward Marcus, blood on his muzzle but moving uninjured. Marcus backed toward the cabin door, providing covering fire, not trying to hit anyone but making it too dangerous for them to advance. He reached the door and pulled Duke inside, slamming it shut and throwing the heavy bolt. Bullets immediately began hammering into the thick log walls, splintering the wood but not penetrating. Marcus dropped to the floor, crawling to the window, using the angle to see the clearing. The men had spread out properly now, using trees and rocks for cover, coordinating their movements with hand signals. Professional tactics, not the random panic shooting of amateurs. This was going to be a real fight, and Marcus was trapped in a wooden box that wouldn't hold forever. He needed the tower. The cab was steel-framed with thick glass windows, far more defensible than the cabin. But getting there meant crossing 30 feet of open ground while under fire. Suicide in daylight, but possible if he created the right diversion. Marcus grabbed the pile of combustibles he'd prepared and began splashing the contents across the cabin's interior. Kerosene and oil soaked into the old wood floors and walls, the chemical smell overwhelming. He pulled on his backpack, made sure his remaining ammunition was secure, and moved to the back wall where a small window faced away from the attackers. He kicked the window open, shoved the muzzle of his pistol through, and fired several shots blindly into the forest behind the cabin. While the men in front reacted to the unexpected gunfire from a new angle, Marcus touched his lighter to the kerosene-soaked floor. The cabin went up like it had been waiting its whole life to burn. Flames raced across the floor and climbed the walls with a roar that drowned out the shouting outside. Smoke filled the interior instantly, thick and black. Marcus pulled his shirt over his mouth, grabbed Duke's collar, and kicked open the front door. He emerged into chaos. The burning cabin created a wall of heat and smoke that provided momentary cover. Marcus ran, not toward the tower but toward the western path, the route he'd prepared with the improvised rock slide. Duke ran beside him, confused but trusting. Behind them, he could hear Hammond screaming orders, could hear the crack of weapons firing. Something hit Marcus high in the left shoulder, spinning him halfway around with an impact like a baseball bat. He stumbled but kept moving, fueled by adrenaline and the absolute refusal to go down. He reached the western path and grabbed the rope he'd secured earlier, yanking it hard. The wedged stones above gave way exactly as planned, tumbling down the slope in a small avalanche that caught one of Carl's men and sent the others scrambling backward. Marcus used the confusion to change direction, circling back toward the tower through the smoke and dust. Every breath was agony now, his shoulder burning with a pain that suggested the bullet had done significant damage. But he was moving, Duke was safe, and the tower stairs were just ahead. He hit the stairs at a full sprint, taking them 3 at a time, his boots ringing on the metal. Below him, Carl was shouting for his men to follow, to cut him off. Marcus reached the cab, stumbled inside, and slammed the heavy door shut. There was a deadbolt, industrial strength, meant to protect valuable equipment from vandals. He threw it just as the first pursuer reached the platform outside. The man hammered on the door, then fired his weapon at the lock. The bullets sparked off the metal but didn't penetrate. The tower cab had been built to withstand lightning strikes and forest fires. It would hold against small arms fire, at least for a while. Marcus collapsed against the far wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Duke pressed against him, whining with concern. Marcus's left arm was useless, hanging limp, his shirt soaked with blood. He forced himself to assess the wound, probing carefully despite the agony. Through and through, high enough that it had probably missed major arteries but low enough that it might have clipped his shoulder blade. He would live if he didn't bleed out or go into shock. He used his teeth and his good hand to tear strips from his shirt, fashioning a crude pressure bandage. The pain was enormous, turning his vision gray at the edges, but he'd been hurt before. Pain was information. It told him he was alive. Outside, the men were regrouping. Through the windows, Marcus could see them taking positions around the base of the tower, recognizing that they had him contained but not defeated. The cabin was fully engulfed now, flames reaching high into the afternoon sky, sending up a column of black smoke visible for miles. That smoke was a beacon, an advertisement that something had gone catastrophically wrong on this mountain. Hammond was on his radio, calling for backup, requesting emergency services. Marcus heard the word firefight and officer down and realized Hammond was spinning the narrative, making this look like Marcus had ambushed lawmen rather than the truth of what had happened. But the smoke would also be visible to other eyes. Saracen, somewhere in this forest doing her wildlife surveys, would see it. The National Forest Service, monitoring for fires, would see it. The state police, the federal authorities, people who weren't on Carl Booker's payroll, would see it. All Marcus had to do was survive long enough for help to arrive. He pulled out his uncle's radio and switched it to Channel 7, the emergency frequency Sarah had mentioned. The transmission would be heard by everyone monitoring, including the men below, but that didn't matter now. Secrecy was dead. This was about creating a record, establishing the truth before Carl could bury it. "This is Marcus Webb at the North Ridge Fire Tower," he said into the microphone, his voice ragged but clear. "I'm under attack by 6 men including Sheriff Ben Hammond and a criminal named Carl Booker. They're attempting to cover up a major drug operation in the northern sector coordinates." He rattled off the GPS location of the compound he'd seen the previous night. "I have photographic evidence of the operation. I'm wounded and pinned down but still alive. If anyone is monitoring this frequency, send help. This is a legitimate distress call." He released the transmit button and waited. Static crackled back at him. Then a voice, male, official sounding. "Copy your distress call, Tower 7. This is Forest Service dispatch. State police are being notified. Emergency services are en route. Estimated arrival 90 minutes. Can you confirm your situation?" 6 armed men, Marcus replied. "They've destroyed my residence and I'm taking fire." One of them fired first. "I have a dog with me who needs veterinary attention. Request immediate law enforcement response and medical evacuation." "Understood, Tower 7. Stay on this frequency. Help is coming." Below, Hammond had heard every word. His face was visible through the window, and the expression there was pure fury. He knew the game had changed. State police meant real investigation, people who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Carl knew it too. The older man was arguing with Hammond, gesturing angrily, clearly advocating for a more permanent solution to the Marcus problem. One of Carl's men produced a can of gasoline from somewhere and began splashing it on the base of the tower. The message was clear. If they couldn't get to Marcus, they would burn him out or burn him alive. The tower was wood and metal, and while it wouldn't burn as quickly as the cabin had, it would burn eventually. Marcus watched them prepare his pyre and felt a strange calmness settle over him. He had done what he could. The evidence was buried where it might be found. The truth was broadcast where it might be heard. Saracen would connect the pieces. The state police would ask questions Hammond couldn't answer. Carl's operation was compromised even if Marcus died defending it. He looked down at Duke, who was lying beside him, the dog's head on his lap. The Belgian Malinois looked up with those trusting amber eyes, and Marcus felt something break inside him. Duke didn't deserve this. The dog had been through enough wars, had earned his peace, and Marcus had brought him to this. "I'm sorry, boy," Marcus whispered, running his good hand through Duke's fur. "You deserved better than this." Duke's tail thumped once against the floor, forgiving what didn't need forgiveness. The gasoline was lit. Flames began climbing the wooden legs of the tower, the heat building quickly. Marcus could feel it through the metal floor of the cab, could smell the smoke starting to seep through the gaps around the door. He had minutes, maybe less. He stood, using the desk to pull himself upright, and looked out the northern window one last time. The compound was visible in the distance, that ugly scar on the pristine forest. His uncle had died trying to expose it. Marcus had tried to finish what Leonard started. Maybe someone else would succeed where they had failed. Then he heard it. The sound that changed everything. The deep, rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors, growing louder by the second. Marcus looked up through the glass ceiling and saw it emerging from the east, a state police helicopter, its markings clearly visible, coming in fast and low. Below, Carl and his men heard it too. They scattered, running for the tree line, abandoning the burning tower. Hammond stood frozen for a moment, perhaps calculating whether he could salvage his position or whether this was the end of everything he'd built. Then he too ran, following Carl into the forest. The helicopter circled once, its loudspeaker booming across the clearing. "This is state police. You are ordered to drop your weapons and show yourselves. Officers on the ground, identify yourselves immediately." The fire at the base of the tower was spreading but not yet critical. Marcus used the radio to contact the helicopter directly, giving them his status and confirming he was the federal ranger who had called for help. Within minutes, a second helicopter arrived, this one equipped for firefighting, and began dropping water and retardant on the burning structures. On the ground, figures in tactical gear were moving through the forest, pursuing Carl's fleeing men. Marcus heard the sharp crack of weapons fire, shouts, the sounds of people being taken into custody. The professional efficiency of law enforcement doing actual law enforcement, not the corrupted version Hammond had represented. A figure emerged from the tree line and ran toward the tower, moving with purpose. Even from his elevated position, Marcus recognized Sarah Chen. She was shouting his name, her face a mixture of relief and fury. Behind her came more officers, paramedics with equipment, people who represented help rather than threat. Marcus unlocked the door and began the painful descent down the stairs, Duke at his heels. Each step sent agony shooting through his wounded shoulder, but he kept moving. By the time he reached the ground, Sarah was there, supporting him, her hands gentle but firm. "You stupid, stupid man," she said, and there were tears in her eyes. "You could have been killed." "Yeah," Marcus agreed weakly. "But I wasn't." The paramedics took over, easing him onto a stretcher, starting in 4, assessing his wounds. Duke tried to follow but was held back by one of the officers. Marcus reached out with his good hand, catching the man's attention. "The dog comes with me. Wherever I go, he goes." The officer looked at Duke, at the blood on the dog's muzzle and the absolute loyalty in his posture, and nodded. "He stays with you." As they loaded Marcus into the medical helicopter, Sarah leaned in close. "The photographs," she said urgently. "Your radio message mentioned evidence. Where is it?" "Root cellar," Marcus managed. "Waterproof container, buried under the 3rd floorboard from the door." "Everything's there." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I'll find it. And I'll make sure everyone sees it." The helicopter lifted off, taking Marcus up and away from the tower that had become his battlefield. Through the window, he could see the entire clearing laid out below, the burning cabin now just smoldering ruins, the tower scorched but standing, the forest stretching out in all directions like a vast green ocean. Somewhere in that forest, Carl Booker and what remained of his operation were being hunted down by people who couldn't be bought. Marcus closed his eyes and let himself sink into the exhaustion that had been held at bay by adrenaline and necessity. Duke's cold nose pressed against his hand, an anchor to the world, a reminder that some things survived even the worst wars. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the clearing again, his arm still in a sling but healing well. The cabin was gone, burned to its foundation, but the tower stood as it always had. Repairs had been made to the scorched legs, and a crew from the Forest Service had declared it structurally sound. Saracen stood beside him, looking over the paperwork that would officially reinstate the tower as an active fire watch station, with Marcus as its primary operator. Carl Booker and 4 of his men were in federal custody, facing charges that would keep them imprisoned for decades. Sheriff Hammond had been arrested after attempting to flee the state. The compound in the northern sector had been raided, yielding nearly $2 million in processed drugs and evidence of an operation that had been running for almost 5 years. The photographs Marcus had taken were being used by federal prosecutors building a case that would likely bring down an entire regional distribution network. "Your uncle would be proud," Sarah said quietly. Marcus wasn't sure about that. Leonard had wanted peace, had wanted to live quietly in the wilderness he loved. Instead, his nephew had turned that wilderness into a war zone. But maybe that was the only way to protect what Leonard had valued. Sometimes peace required fighting for it. Duke barked once, drawing their attention. The dog was staring up the tower stairs, his tail wagging, his body language suggesting it was time to climb. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile in longer than he could remember. "Yeah, boy," he said. "Let's go up. Someone has to keep watch." They climbed together, man and dog, ascending into the glass room that overlooked the vast Montana wilderness. From that height, the forest looked untouched, eternal, perfect. The scars of recent violence were invisible from here, healed by distance and perspective. Marcus settled into the chair his uncle had used for 40 years and picked up the binoculars. His watch had begun. Not just for fires, but for anything that threatened this place, these trees, this wilderness that had given him purpose when he thought he had none left. He had come here seeking isolation, hiding from memories he couldn't escape. Instead, he had found exactly what he needed. A reason to stand. A reason to fight. A reason to keep watching when everyone else looked away. His uncle had understood that. Had known that sometimes the best therapy for a broken soldier wasn't solitude but duty, not forgetting but protecting. Duke rested his head on Marcus's knee, and together they watched the sun move across the sky, painting the mountains in shades of gold and shadow. Somewhere in the forest below, life continued its ancient rhythms, predator and prey, growth and decay, the endless cycle that needed no human understanding to continue. But Marcus would watch anyway. Because that's what guardians did. They stood their post, they kept faith with the fallen, and they made sure that the darkness, when it came, would find them ready. The tower stood sentinel over the wilderness, and in its glass room high above the trees, Marcus Webb had finally come home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.